Welcome to the Libido Lounge, where we focus on all things love, lust, and libido. We believe that fabulous sex is important to health as exercise and good food. Everybody, welcome back to another episode on the Libido Lounge. I'm your host, libido expert, Dr. Diane Mueller. I'm thrilled to have Amy Rowan, the suburban sexologist, a sex and intimacy coach, here with me today. Thank you so much for joining me, Amy.
Thank you so much for having me here, Dr. Diane. I'm so excited to be speaking with you, and I'm just really excited to be chatting with you and your audience today.
Yeah, it's really going to be a good topic. It's like what we were talking about offline, this need for this topic of talking about what happens post mastectomy as far as libido and sex and our relationships. And, even things like when I've talked to women around having mastectomies, it's like this level of like reclaiming ourselves as women and our confidence and everything that's connected there. So can you start with just like telling us a little bit about like what that process was for you and how it impacted your relationships and your libido and your sexuality, as well as how that was as far as beginning to heal from the double mastectomy?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was diagnosed at age 38. So, sort of on the younger side. And, there's no family history. So, I don't think, I think whenever you get diagnosed with cancer, it's always a shock, but, it certainly came out of left field. And I remember, when I learned that I was going to be having a double mastectomy, going online, like we all do, doing quote unquote research. And I was trying to find like, what is sex going to be like? Like, what am I going to look like? Am I going to feel, I just had so many different questions and I couldn't really find any information about that. And so there was just sort of this big blank space of like, what is this going to impact my relationship? Like, what am I going to look like? I didn't even know what I was going to look like when I woke up, from the mastectomy. Um, then you wake up and your body is completely different and you're covered in scars. And, a large part of what makes you feel like a woman or how you've defined yourself as a woman all these years is very different and gone. And, it was a shock, understandably so. And so it was just sort of trying to figure out who am I now? Like, what does this mean for me?
So what was that process then? So you wake up, you're like, oh my goodness, how am I defined as a woman? Like, what does this mean? What was that process? Like, what did you do from a standpoint then of almost reclaiming your femininity and your new body? How was that process for you?
Well, it's really funny and some people, and maybe I was crazy. I don't know. Like, I think what was very important for me, and this is kind of personal, but we're here on the Libido Lounge, right?
Yeah, that's what we do.
Was I needed to know that my body still worked. That's how I defined it in my head. Like, I was like, am I still going to be able to experience pleasure? Like, what's that going to look like? Am I going to be stuck in my head? All these different things. And so, 2 weeks after my double mastectomy, and I had tram reconstruction, which is a pretty, serious invasive reconstruction. I looked at my husband and I was like, let's get some pillows and figure this out. And I just really wanted to have sex because I just needed to know like what my body could do. And what I don't think I realized I was doing at that point, but I'm glad that I did, was I kind of that elephant that could have started growing in the room at that point, I kind of kicked it out because I was just like, I'm going to see what's happening. I'm going to, it's going to go slowly. I'm still wearing all of these weird, garments and stuff like that. But I think that was a big step in sort of reclaiming or stepping back into myself as a woman and as a sexual being, of just like, okay, I'm not going to let this define me. Like, I don't have nipples anymore. I don't have any of these things, but I want to, just see how things are. And I think that also then sort of bridged a gap for my husband because, of course, he's taking care of me. And there's caregiver, there's so many different dynamics that happen in there of just the caregiver. And of course, he didn't want to push me or pressure me or anything of that nature. But me approaching him and saying, look, let's just try this. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if we're going to be able to finish or start, or if it's going to feel good, or if I'm going to start crying in the middle of it, which I probably did. But going through that, I was like, okay, like, yeah, things are different, but different isn't bad and different isn't insurmountable. And I think that was like a really important, step for me.
I really appreciate that angle of just calling it the elephant in the room and just saying, hey, this is happening and we're going to just do this anyways. And it's kind of, I mean, it's a different version, very different version, but has a level of analogy to, I feel like, couples that have not had sex in a long time. And it's like, okay, well, this might be awkward. I don't know what's going to happen. It might feel weird. Maybe there's this, maybe there's that, maybe there's stories, maybe I'm going to cry, but we're just going to rip the Band-Aid off and just go for it. And so then what, did you find that when you were actually re-engaging, did you find that from a sexual standpoint that your libido took a little while to turn back on? How did that go as far as like communicating with your partner?
I think since we ripped the Band-Aid off, that helped with that. But there's the other thing was we were forced to, because there's areas that he couldn't, or he was afraid to touch me, because scars and things that were healing and things like that. At some point I remember noticing that, there's areas of my body that are still numb. It's been 7 years. And, I was like, honey, I want you to just run your hand through. I was like, I want to see where I have feeling and where I don't, and where things feel different. And just acknowledging that and just sort of having those conversations, I think, was really important in those moments. And, I think for me personally, I've always been a higher libido kind of person. And sex is my stress. I know a lot of people, when they're stressed out, their libido crashes. And for me, sex is like a stress relief. And so in the times that I'm like the most stressed out, there's the worst things that are going on, like that. Like that hormone flood that comes through, the oxytocin and all that stuff, like that is like my calming place. And so I think for me, it almost became like a tool of healing, on many levels, of just maintaining the bond with my husband, of regaining my femininity and myself as a woman, and, and recognizing, okay, so I mean, I don't have nipples and I look kind of weird in the mirror now, but that's okay. Like, I'm still a sexual being. I'm still a woman. That's not like, it didn't take that away from me.
And it sounds like then actually engaging with your husband and going through the actions of sex and being touched and exploring what's numb and what's not, like that, if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like that actually contributed to like, yeah, like, yes, I am still this woman. I'm still beautiful, and really kind of reconfirming that level of confidence. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it built that confidence, even more. I think like many, many women, before and certainly during and through this, you have all sorts of body confidence issues. And I still do. Like, that hasn't necessarily changed. But yes, but just being willing to say, you know what, rather than ignoring it, because I think things that are uncomfortable, sometimes it's just easier to sweep them under the rug and just pretend like that they aren't happening. And then it grows and grows and grows into something bigger than it needs to be. And so, just confronting it and talking about it, and just taking the power back from it and saying, you know what, no, I'm not going to let this take away something that is pleasurable and it feels amazing. And it's an important part of my marriage, an important part of my relationship, an important part of it just feels good. Like, I want this and I'm going to keep this because I'm not going to let this take it. Like, I lost my boobs. So, that's it. That's all that you get to take from me on that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really inspiring. And I want to talk also in the way you're explaining this of even just kind of not shoving things under the rug and end of directly communicating with your husband. Let's talk a little bit more about that, because while I know there's some of our listeners that have had double mastectomies or other types of changes in their body, regardless, the communications and strategies I'm sure you experience and explore during the stressful time applies to, to people regardless of whether or not they've gone through those types of situations. So can you tell us about, like, from a strategy, standpoint around communicating with your husband during this time of which could be very stressful and could, for some couples, really drive them apart? Were there like specific strategies that you really found like, oh, we did XYZ beyond not shoving things under the rug that was really helpful?
I think what's really important for people to hear, for members in a couple to hear in a situation like this or otherwise, is that that they're still being seen. And I think, when you have a dynamic, again, if you've got a caregiver, person recovering dynamic or other things, one person may not want to say something like, hey, honey, I think you look beautiful today, because they're afraid maybe that person's going to interpret that as, oh, well, my partner wants to have sex and how dare he, and it may not be that at all. But, just acknowledging and saying, but I think the other thing that people need to hear is, and certainly when you're questioning your body confidence and, dealing with big changes in your body, you need to hear like, I'm thinking about you today. Like you look beautiful. Is it okay if I give you a kiss? Because I just like to give you a kiss. And maybe asking, because if that person is in a fragile emotional state, which certainly happens, but just having those overtures, because I think people can have a tendency to retreat into opposite corners of the room, of the house, just out of sheer fear of potentially hurting somebody. And then if one person is drawing away to protect the other person, that other person is starting to feel this distance that the first person isn't necessarily intending. And then all of a sudden it's just growing and growing. And so I think it's just, and I also always, I think another thing that we did was, like we weren't able to hug for a very long time because, it hurt. And so just finding other ways of touch, offering touch, whether it's interlocking legs across the couch, like maybe you can't be really close to each other, but you can still find ways of offering touch, of holding hands, of things like that, non-sexual, but just, physical intimacy, because again, oxytocin and all the good hormones, all that good stuff. So just finding those ways to maintain just affection and intimacy are really important, because, certainly people are going through extended treatment too. I'm grateful I didn't have to go through chemo and radiation, but, that may be off the table. It may have to be off the table. But there's certainly ways of maintaining that physical intimacy outside of sexual intimacy. And then when it can come back on the table, it's going to be easier if you, aren't feeling quite so separate.
Then how much of that, so I love everything you're saying. I'm curious with like how much of that were you guys actually say actively planning that? Meaning like, oh, as soon as you realize like, oh, wow, honey, we can't hug because it hurts. How much time did you actually spend like dialoguing, and how much was that a part around like, oh, we need to do X, Y, Z and strategize around how we can still get touch? Like, did you guys have active communication around the strategy, or did you guys just naturally figure that out just kind of by trial and error?
I'd say it's probably more of natural figuring it out. We have always been a fairly affectionate couple. We're just an affectionate family. I think maybe the conscious part of it that I remember thinking, because my children at the time were 3, 6, and 9. And, a 3-year-old, how do you explain to a 3-year-old that you can't hug mommy? And that was one of the ones where, I remember speaking to somebody and she said, teach him how to do a leg hug. And that was it. Like, I was like, okay, honey, we can do a leg hug. Like, and, he was, and he still is just incredibly active. Like teaching him not to climb on me was very, very, very difficult. And of course it broke my heart because all I wanted to do was hug my child. Yes. So, we were doing leg hugs and so I think that was a little bit where that, conscious communication came in around how can I continue to show affection, to my children too, in a way that they can understand. But then that also brought in just those ideas into our relationship as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I ask because I'm curious too for our listeners, like, is there anything that you would recommend in going, and like with a double mastectomy, but also just with stress in general and thinking about libido around like, hey, these are a few top things from a communication standpoint that you want to make sure you have as part of that foundation of keeping things, hot, of keeping things connected, of keeping that relationship strong. Are there any like foundational principles that you have in that communication sphere at all?
I think just like asking the question, and if you aren't sure, if you're like, I want, like, honey, I really like, I would like to, I want to touch you, I want to hug you, how can I do that in a way that feels good for you? Like, just ask the question. I think some people are so afraid of asking the wrong question that they just don't ask anything at all, when really that's the wrong thing, is not saying anything. So I would say that if you aren't sure what to do, then say, you know what, I'm really not sure what to do right now. I'm not sure how to say this, but I love you and I care about you. And, I would love to hold your hand right now. Is that okay with you? And if the person is not having a day where maybe they want to have their hand held, just say, sweetie, I'm not up for that right now. Why don't you check in with me, in a few hours, because I'm really tired. I'm going to go take a nap, And so it's not a no, it's not a leave me alone. It's a, maybe not this isn't the right time, but check in with me, XYZ. And then that's also leaving that door open and avoiding that rejection.
Yeah, I think those are really important points around like asking permission and allowing that. And then, leaving, like you said, leaving that door open so that we still have the ability to say no without having that person's ego, be hurt of like, oh, I'm reaching out and now my hand is like left without a response. It's like, no, I'm still responding. I'm just going to respond and let you know when I can still help you meet that need. So it's really beautiful. And anything else before we wrap up our time today that you want to make sure that we say that we didn't say that you definitely want to get across in our conversation today?
I just want to say that don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I don't know what's going on here. I don't know what this is going to look like, but I want to walk this journey with you. Something as devastating and as scary as mastectomy, different types of cancer. I mean, it is going to change your life. But that doesn't mean that you can't still have satisfying, wonderful, pleasurable intimacy. It may look different than it did before, and it may look different in more positive ways than you can ever imagine. Sometimes difference forces creativity, and that's when things get really fun. So just know that if it's something that you want to maintain in your life, it's absolutely possible. There's always hope. And, really the most important thing to do is just reach out to the person with you and just tell them you love them and you want to figure it out.
Love it. And thank you so much for spending time with us today. I know you have a couple gifts for our audience. So can you tell us about those? And we'll have everything as far as how to get a hold of you in our show notes here. But if there's anything you want to say as far as that or your gifts, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got 2 free gifts available. So my first is my 5 tips for sexy scheduled sex, which I'm a big advocate for, especially for busy couples. You've got kids, things like that. It's just a really fun way of spicing that up. And then I also have a workbook on regaining intimacy after mastectomy or major surgery. So please go ahead and download those. And I hope that they can really help you out.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I love this conversation. I know this is going to help so many people. So really appreciate you spending time with me again today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Diane. And thank you to everyone in the audience. I want to commend you for being here and listening and learning.
To wrap up, everybody, just as a reminder, this is the year where we are taking all of our best guests. So basically the guests that you rate and you download, and we're tracking all the downloaded episodes and we're tracking all the shares and all that. And whoever has the most downloads and shares, we're going to invite back at the end of the year so we can have a longer deep dive. So make sure you share this, make sure you download this, make sure you don't keep us a secret, and tell your friends about us, because that will help us get Amy back for an even bigger conversation in the future. And again, as always, this is Dr. Diane reminding you to stay classy, stay sexy, and always be a little badassy. See you next time. Thank you for listening to the Libido Lounge. Please don't keep me a secret. Please share this with your friends. You can find me on YouTube, on Instagram, as well as how to work with me at mylibidodoc.com.